So this session is a good follow-on, I think, from the last session where I think I heard the word data about 7 times in the last 10 minutes or so. So we've got a good diverse panelists with us today. So Alexis, let me start with you since you're number 2 and I presume you try harder. So y'all are a major data provider. I mean, 2 questions, sort of some interlinkages. How do the FIs use your data, one? But more importantly, what are your views on having a global data standard or a global common?
Yes, thank you, Vivek. I think that's an excellent question. I think maybe for those of you in the fintech space who don't really know about us, what we're doing, and I think there's a lot of commonalities with our friends at Bloomberg, is the fact that we have hundreds of analysts, more than 600, I think, for us only at LSEG, analysts who are analyzing, collecting sustainability data from companies all over the world, which is usually disclosed in sustainability reports, website, CDP reports, and we like to thank everyone. Everyone would like to thank CDP for being the gold standard of climate reporting around the world. But the major question is, okay, so we gather all these data that is unstructured, unstandardized in various different places, and that takes a lot of money to collect. And then we package it and we analyze it in ways that can be used by financial institutions. Okay, that sounds good. And it sounds very sophisticated, but at the end of the day, what we noticed is that our research shows that even among the large and medium caps, which is a few thousand companies, only 40% of them disclose scope 1 and 2 emissions, which is the basic minimum that you need for any sort of climate reporting. And the figures drop even more when it comes to small caps, and even more when it comes to scope 3 data. And so, yes, you could think that fintech companies, and there's a lot of analytics going on. And Vivek was telling me earlier that there's probably too many of us doing that very same job of collecting, analyzing, and reselling data. But when you look at the fundamentals of data in the market, there's actually very few companies disclosing really what matters. And another piece of research that we released actually just last month shows that actually when just look at scope 3 emissions, which is like the next big thing in climate data, there's 15 categories of scope 3 emissions. So you can think, well, that's a lot to report on. But we actually have found that for each industrial sector, so that like the utilities, telecommunications, all of that, for each sector, only the most two material sectors, the most two material scope 3 categories among the 15 correspond to 80% of the total scope 3 emissions of companies. Which means that companies, when it comes to scope 3, they don't need to disclose all 15 categories of scope 3 emissions, but actually if they can just disclose the 2 most material scope 3 categories of those 15, they will already cover most of the carbon emissions. Which means that when it comes to like sustainability and climate data, it's about reporting better and more accurate, more specific data that corresponds to the business model of companies, rather than have lots of companies reporting on everything. And this is really why it becomes very interesting, and where you guys come in the fintech space, because there's a need to help companies getting started on 2 things. Getting started on new climate disclosures, and getting started on identifying the data points that are the most material for the industry. And so in the previous panel discussion, there was also a mention of the Net Zero Data Public Utility, another acronym. I know we've been blaming the industry for using too many acronyms. So the NZDPU is the global common public utility for climate. Our CEO at LSEG is on the technical advisory board, and the idea is to create a global platform, a public utility that will help companies report on the very basics of scope 1, 2, and scope 3 data for climate. And so to answer the question, and I will hand over to my other fellow panelists, to answer the question, yes, I think a global commons for climate would be incredibly useful. But it's not going to be an answer for everything. But the idea is to provide visibility to financial institutions, financial market participants on what companies are doing at the very strict basic minimum. And once we have that generated level of new data information, which isn't about the 20,000 listed companies in the world, but the hundreds of thousands of companies that constitute the real world economy, then I think financial institutions can start to do more than just listing or delisting companies or making some fancy portfolio attribution. They can really start to invest in the projects that deliver real world decarbonization solution. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Alexis. Let's go to number one now, Bloomberg. And Hikari, first question for you is, what specific challenges do you all see in this sector? If you can share your views on that.
Thank you. So as a data provider, we have seen great improvement in ESG disclosure for the last decade in terms of number of companies disclosing ESG data for the market, as well as range and quality of the reported data. However, there are still some challenges we face as a data provider beyond the data availability in data collection and procurement of the data, such as how the data is disclosed. So this can be broken down into different types of documents, disclosure platform, timeline, and scope of disclosure. ESG data is disclosed in various different document types, such as CSR, sustainability report, annual integrity report, policy reports in ESG data book. With the help from regulations, some markets have standardized reporting on exchange or equivalent platform, while some companies in other markets, their own corporate websites still the primary platforms to disclose their reports. In addition to that, while majority of the companies are filing standalone reports in accessible file formats such as PDF, in fact, there are some companies still disclose their ESG information as a website content without filing a report. Digitalization of the reporting is something we expect to see more in this industry with the support of technology and regulators. Currently, majority of ESG disclosure consists of hundreds of pages of documents under multiple different reporting frameworks and a lot of narrative information. This is also observed in the reported data regarding companies' transition pathway. Apart from targets set by companies, quantitative data on transition plan makes data collection and comparison very challenging. More standardized data disclosed on green CapEx linked to financial statement assessment of where companies are towards their goals are something more we expect to see. In addition to standardization of the data definitions, with implementation of the digital taxonomy, such as XBRL and JSON format, we hope to see more clarity in reporting. For example, adding Boolean answers in reporting qualitative initiatives, or making selection of unit of measure or scaling for quantitative data required to minimize the reporting and printing errors. In addition, timing of disclosure varies per company for the market without specific requirement in this area, and this makes the data collection process further complex. Standardized timing of the data release promotes more access to those information by users so that they can refer and use those information to their analysis without waiting for additional weeks and months for certain companies having different timing of disclosure under their portfolios. Other areas are reporting entity, the scope of disclosure. Ideally, a reporting entity is the same as the related financial statements. Taking GHG emission data as an example, there are some cases where the reported GHG emission data belongs to only a few subsidiary or geography, and that represent less than 30% of the group. This type of data disclosure lacks data comparability, and improving this area brings more useful and valuable information to our data consumers. Thank you.
So just a very quick follow-up question, since you come from a firm which is not only big on data, but also in technology. What do you think technology, the role of technology going forward in order to get this even more, I would say, democratized?
So digitalization of the reporting is one thing. Currently, as I mentioned, there's a lot of narrative or qualitative information, and it takes time for data provider like us to consume the data and deliver the data in the standardized format in our clients too. And so with the help from technology, like implementing digital taxonomy would help the reporter to bring more standardized data to the data consumers and as well as the data providers.
Okay, thank you so much, Kari. Kyoko, over to you. CDP is also clearly got a huge niche spot and has a huge reach. So if you can talk about some of the work you're doing, the number of firms you're reaching, How is that data used? But very importantly, next steps. Where do you see this going? If you can sort of flow it into that.
Thank you very much. Yeah, CDP produces climate questionnaire from scratch and sent to corporations, financial institutions, and municipalities every year. The important point is that CDP questionnaire is aligned with TCFD recommendation. So we ask not only emission data reduction target or other risk management opportunity. So companies have to respond to these comprehensive questions. And CDP collect these original data to our system and feedback to financial institutions and other users. Also, LSEG or Bloomberg uses our data as a kind of primary data source. And this year, we sent more than 30,000 companies questionnaire, and only 50% around, like 23,000 companies responded to our questionnaire. It means about half of the companies do not want to disclose their performance to CDP. This is a big problem to achieve net zero economy, because without measurement, we cannot set target and reduce emissions and report to financial institutions. Data should be comparable, consistent. We are aiming for this high quality database, and the financial institutions use this high quality data for their risk management to produce financial products and risk and decision-making process.
So just following up from that, sort of going forward, how do you see this space emerging clearly? So I agree with you, we need high quality data, but I think we also need to understand that there are people who can't pay for that, a typical SME, and that's about 60% of an economy. So we need to balance that, and I think that's where technologies will come in. But in your view, next steps, where do you think, which direction should this be headed in? And if you can very quickly touch upon the need for, as we said earlier, a need for a global common standard. What's the importance of that in your view?
Yeah, CDP knows your request, investors' request, that want to use efficiently use data, but collecting data needs resources, increasing cost, human, and technologies. But good news is that we are not alone. We have established an ecosystem for data disclosure, including that net zero data produce utility something, and also like investors collaboration with G funds or technology from LSEG and Bloomberg. So we can collaborate together to achieve these for user-friendly, efficient database establishment.
Okay, no, thank you so much. So I think we've heard from Bloomberg, we've heard from LSE, we've heard from CD. These are people who collect data, who analyze the data. But I think it's very important to hear from an investor and one who's in the real world using their balance sheet to invest in some of these firms. So there's a lot of talk about the amount of data needed. And if you can touch upon, and I'm a big believer in quality versus quantity. So if you can touch upon that, and given that you're actually using this, if you can take us through a sort of a use case to share with the audience on how you're using this.
Sure, thank you very much. And so you're the provider, so I'm basically the receiving end of the data. But before talking about, and to some extent answering your question, it's not just the quantity, but rather the quality and quantity both matters. But let me unpack what that means and what kind of data are we talking about. But first of all, who are we? we are a Japanese financial institution. We have banking, we have asset management, we do underwriting as well. So we are, institution doing all of financial services. But today I want to talk from a banking perspective, basically the lending perspective. You often hear in the context of climate, we use data as an excuse, right? Oh, data isn't available, it's not there, and we are dependent on clients. True, I use that as an excuse, but I don't want to stop there, but rather to some extent push the envelope. So what can we do together? So what are we missing? I want to, first of all, talk about what kind of data or what's the purpose of the data or use case so that we know what kind of data we are talking about. When we say data, we are primarily talking about data for the management of risk management, but also for the purpose of identifying financing opportunities. As I said earlier, I am talking as a bank today. So we're not, of course, as I said, we have an asset management arm, but asset manager, you want to identify investment opportunities and you invest, right? You invest in secondary market, whether you're equity, debt, that's who you are. We're a commercial bank, so we're not just sitting here and say, okay, where do we see investment opportunity? Rather, we have to go to see our clients. We need to identify, we need to basically provide solution to our clients and say, what do you think? And if our client says, oh, that sounds great, then there's that business opportunity, right? So for us, it's not just about, how should I say, passively looking at the data and say, is this investable or not? But rather, we need to proactively go to our clients and identify the data. So identify the business opportunity. So when I say data, it's not just about, how should I say, comparative data that you can do the modeling. Of course, that's important, but that's not the end of the story, but rather that's just the beginning of the story. So we committed to net zero, including finance emission, as you touched on a few minutes ago. Net zero for financial institution, meaning it's not scope 1, 2, but basically we're talking about scope 3. So it's our clients' emission that we need to reduce down to net zero by 2050, and we also have 2030 interim target. How do we get there? We need to talk to our clients, we need to solve their problem, and we can provide solution. That's how it works. We're not just investing in their securities or debt, but rather we're visiting our clients to find financing opportunity. And if our clients, through our financial services, can reduce their emission, our scope 3 will also go down. So that's how it works. And that's exactly why it's not just about data analytics, but rather identifying opportunity, manage the risk, and you reduce the emission down to zero. That's the whole purpose of the use of data. So what are we doing in this whole journey to net zero? We are reviewing and updating our risk management framework that is fit for purpose for this net zero journey. Used to be, the risk management was all about you calculate probability of default and loss given default. So it was more about backward looking. So you have all the historical data, you analyze the risk, and you come up with the appropriate return for the risk you're taking. But this net zero journey is different because you need to understand how the emission will look like 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now. As I said, we have 20-30-year target. So we need to know where we will be 7 years from now, not 7 months from now. So that's the type of data that we need for us to identify opportunity, but also manage the risk and also understanding where our finance emission will go. So it isn't just about the database, but it's combination of the data that you are going to provide. But we also need to talk to our clients directly because it's not just about the data, but it's more about the strategic thinking that you need to understand. And I don't think that can be added in your data template. So this is where global aligned framework is very important for us to have that data availability for the, how should I say, very fundamental analysis that we have to do of our clients. But is that sufficient? No. So that's why we have 2 steps approach. One is to use the publicly available data, including CDP's data. So we do modeling. We try to understand the risk of our clients. So that's the first step. The second step is to some extent complement the first step is to do qualitative analysis of our clients. So strategy, for example, what are the technologies that our clients are implementing? Is this aligned with, for example, government policy? All these things are not necessarily reflected or disclosed in the data, but we need to understand that. So we visit our clients, we have that dialogue, et cetera, et cetera. So as I said, it's a two-steps approach, data analytics, but also qualitative assessment to fully understand our clients' thinking in their net zero journey, so we can identify the opportunity and we can finance their strategy, because at the end of the day, their emission is our emission, so we want to help our clients' emission reduction, so that also allows us to reduce our finance emission. So it's not just about the data, but data is fundamental to do all of this project that I described.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you, because typically data has been looked at from the investor's perspective, and this is a good company, this is a not so good, and this is a bad company. And I think I can share an example which happened with us. We issued a green bond for one of our clients many years back. I'm talking about the first green bond in the ASEAN. And this was in December, and they were struggling. They said, we don't have green assets even for $150 million. And we spent a lot of time with them, helping them identifying the green work they're doing and the green opportunities they have. And 2 months after that was issued, they said, oh, we have another need for another $500 million now. So I think, and that's a lot of work that IFC does, is helping clients, banks, and firms identify what is there in the books. But just a follow-up question for you, because we're talking about data and a lot of it is linked to emissions, but I also want to touch on the adaptation side. Is climate risk is clearly posing a huge challenge to the balance sheet of banks, and I mean largely to corporates and therefore to banks, especially in SMEs. So I mean, how are you looking at that, and what do you think can be done in that space using some of the data that we have here?
So it's one thing to do, for example, scenario analysis, either transition risk or physical risk. To some extent, adaptation relates to physical risk, right? Of course, as a bank, and risk management is bread and butter for us, right? You do risk management because we manage our depositors' money. This is not my money, it's our depositors' money. We lend to our clients, making sure that we properly manage the risk. So that's very fundamental thing that we do. However, looking backward, looking at current portfolio versus what type of portfolio do we want to create to facilitate our clients' transition and also ensuring that we reach our net zero. That's not necessarily exactly the same exercise, right? Again, you need to understand your exposure, your transition risk and physical risk, but doesn't mean that your risk will crystallize in the next 2 years, 3 years, because we know we're talking about multi-decade risk, right? And as many of you know, banks lending are normally 2 to 3 years. We're not talking about like 20 years term loan, but rather 2, 3, 5, maximum 5 years. So does that mean those risks will materialize in the next 2 years? Of course, you never know, but very unlikely, right? So this is where understanding risk is one thing, but you also want to spend perhaps more time with clients, identifying financing opportunity, making sure that from their perspective, we're providing solution, but from our perspective, their net zero strategy is aligned with our strategy. So this is where it's not just about data, it's not just about numbers, but rather basically we're in the same boat together with our clients. How do we navigate net zero of this whole economy, society to net zero is the fundamental goal of our net zero journey. So again, I'm not trying to undermine the importance of data. Data is fundamental, but is that everything in our journey to net zero? Not really. So it's a bit of both. It's data, but also discussion with our clients, trying to understand what will drive the client's transition to net zero and how we can help their transition. So it's kind of, everything that we need to be to work on, so that this, because this is such a huge undertaking that we are part of. Data is going to be a very important tool to facilitate the journey. But just one comment, finish my comment with one last thing. Garbage in, garbage out, right? So if the data is poor, our analysis will likely to be, I don't want to call it garbage, but not necessarily useless, so useful. So we relying on you, but I know you relying on corporate. So at the end of the day, we're all kind of depending on somebody else. So we want to make sure that the database that we utilize are accurate and also up to date. So we really look forward to looking at your database, but NZDPU will probably be the most promising project for all of us. So let me stop there. Thank you.
No, that's really important, because data is, I would argue, just one cog in the wheel in this whole transition to net zero. And it's going to be different in different countries, and I'll come back to that. But Alexis, clearly you wanted to add to that, but I also wanted to ask you on costs. Now, it's very easy, or relatively easy, for a large firm to pay for a lot of this, but to do this data collection. But if you look at, and my favorite topic is SMEs for some strange reason, 60% of typically the of GDP in many countries. And one can argue back of the envelope 50 to 65% of carbon emissions. So if we are going to be serious about net zero, how do you think we can best tackle this issue related to costs, especially for the smaller firms?
Thanks, Vivek. I think that's a very important question, especially when we're looking at less sophisticated market when it comes to sustainability data, but also smaller firms that are yet to embark on their sustainability reporting journey, where, because especially if we take the viewpoint of investors, we have a tendency to look at the large firms that have sometimes decades of experience in reporting data. And I think, as Ishikawa-san mentioned, I think this, all that data is important, but that's just a hint, a beginning part of the solution, but that's not the entire solution. And I think those large companies often, at a great cost, have entire sustainability departments that whose sole task or whose main project throughout the year is to establish those sustainability reports. And by all means, sustainability reporting has come a long way from being in the 80s, 90s, 2000, really about showing that companies are doing something that they care, to more recently nowadays really about, so what does it mean for investors, for financial institutions? What are our needs? What do we want to achieve? And that comes with a cost, but also I think we are on the verge of seeing a transformation of the sustainability reporting practices away from the entire narrative around, well, we care about sustainability because it's a good for business, it's important for our customer base, which are all valid points, but at the same time not really what we need to know to transition to low carbon business models. So I think this is really where, well, and once again, I think we can always agree, like I think Ishikawa-san mentioned that we all kind of are dependent on each other, but also somehow have the tendency to blame each other. You know, the financial institutions blame the data providers, and we're like, oh well, but we only work with publicly available data, so you look at your corporates, you're not doing enough. And so I think it's really, there's, in that value chain of generating, collecting, and using data, I think there's a lot of places where the fintech industry, where I think most of you come from, can help. And we actually also at LSEG, something we're doing with that, for instance, we've built a new project or a new platform in collaboration with partners, which is called the Sustainability Intelligence, which is, and I'm not here to do a marketing speech, but it's just to say that this is just one of the initiatives that we're trying to do to help small and medium-sized companies, especially in the APAC region, get started, because what we don't want is to have an ESG backlash like in the US, where people look at all these mess of lots of criteria and say, well, none of that is relevant for us. And what we don't want is also companies being overwhelmed by increasing cost of reporting. And so what does it mean? That there's probably a lot of ways by which the fintech industry can create like what we're trying to do as well, but you know, these sort of like reporting platforms through which companies can start on their journey and look at their business model and look at how they can report things that matter for investors. And I think another point that I think Ishikawa-san was mentioning, which I thought was also interesting, is we tend to look at sustainability from the perspective of avoiding risk. And obviously from a bank perspective, that makes a lot of sense, but also what's even more important, I believe, is to look at it from, well, the opportunity side. Well, we are transitioning away from something, but towards something else, right? And so what is this something else? So one of the databases that we have, which is, I believe, very unique, is about green revenues. So we're looking at companies and what they're doing as a business, and we're collecting data on what is the percentage of their total revenue as a business that come from activities that you can consider as being green, notably as per different taxonomies and regulatory regimes. And what is striking to us is that at the end of the day, this is revenue data. So it's financial data, by all means, right? It's not even sustainability. You just categorize it as green, being green or not being green. And what is striking, even for the largest listed universe of 20,000 companies, well, there's only 40% of companies that in our listed universe that discloses standardized revenue data. So it means that even on revenue data, even on financial data, which we think is the model that we like to achieve as data providers, we want to ideally to have sustainability data mirror the way companies are dealing with financial data. Even that is lacking a lot. And so anything that helps companies realize, well, you can, sustainability data should work in the same way as financial data, well, even that is lacking. And even that helping companies improve that will help us generate better databases that can therefore be used in a better way by financial institutions. But now, I will finish on that point though, which is that often when we talk about sustainability data, we say, oh, well, we want sustainability data to work in the same way as financial data, which is why the major sustainability reporting data, which is data standard, which is the SSB, is very closely mirroring the way that financial data is being reported, so the global standard by the IFRS. And that is true. We want companies to deal with sustainability data in the smooth way. We want it to work like that, to generate it as part of the integrated business, to be audited in the same way, to be looked by regulators in the same way, and used by financial institutions in the same way. The only thing I was thinking or looking at this topic is, at the same time, sustainability data is data with a purpose. It's a data with the underlying assumption that businesses are operating in a context of economic, social, and environmental boundaries that isn't working. And so it's data that is meant to be used as a way for financial institutions and corporates to transition away from a model that doesn't work towards a model that works. And so that's a challenge for all of us to solve, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. So that's really useful. I mean, I think from what you said, in the way it's used. I wanted to come back to a point which has been troubling me, because a lot of firms actually out there are giving a sustainability score. From an investor's perspective, I can have 5 firms giving me a sustainability score for the same company. I don't know, honestly, what in God's name that means. And what I want to come to both of you all is, if you all can touch, you can touch upon it, is how do we move towards a more consistent sort of way of looking at this? And there are clearly, I wouldn't say irregularities, but differences in the way different firms are looking at. Sometimes I suspect the same piece of data. So therefore, what is the importance of coming up with a consistent way to look at it across sort of the same firm? Would you like to, either of you all?
We try to be consistent, and questionnaire revises every year in order to respond to their users' need. And this year and next year, we will have a questionnaire aligned with TNFD, nature-based, science-based target, TNFD. And for CDP questionnaire, our questionnaire will align with TCFD as well as TNFD. This kind of challenges development going on every year. And even though we have a sector-based questionnaire like heavy utility or shipping or financial institutions questionnaire, but the governance, risk, and opportunity, this kind of quality information is common to all companies. And we are keeping consistency by this kind of developing questionnaire process, not kind of same question every year to other people.
Would you like to, very quickly?
For Bloomberg, we also provide ESG scores. And for us, I think it's important to provide transparency in our methodology. Like every data provider, scoring company has their own, different rating system. And it's important for us to provide transparency, how we do value the reported data and how we come up with a scoring methodology, because different industry data availability also different. So materiality frameworks is quite important, and we do provide those methodology and transparency with our clients. And in addition to that, data availability, so like I mentioned, currently there are many quantitative data, but also qualitative and narrative data a lot to report the ESG initiatives by each company. So for us, in terms of technology, we have been built on AI semantic model or LLM, large language model, to identify those information based on our historical model, so that we were able to identify as many as company initiative to incorporate those data into scores. And lastly, reporting error is one of the issue to us, to the clients, to our clients, as well as the corporate. So for us, we've started to cover restatement revision data. So when there is a company change the methodology on calculating scope 1, scope 3, we also cover those original data as well as the restated data, so that we bring transparency how initially the corporate provided the data and how they restated the data, so that client can consider which data to take based on the reported data availability. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, Ishikawa-san, would you like to add to that?
Yeah. So what is interesting in, for example, ESG scoring or whatever the rating that you provide, not you, but this ESG rating firms provide, if I step back a little bit and think, what does it mean? We, meaning banking business, we're not in the business of picking winner and forget about losers. If you're an equity investor, you want to make sure that you invest in winner and you don't want to have exposure to lose. I don't want to call it loser, but those companies with not necessarily strong equity story. But from our perspective, we're not in the business. So what does it mean? And not that I push that idea, but to some extent, you could argue that if the company has lower ESG score, all you have to do is charge a higher interest rate, because at the end of the day, as I said earlier, this is about risk management, not trying to pick who the winner is or not, but rather if the risk is high, as long as the interest rate or the return is high, you could justify. So it's more about thinking about this portfolio level finance emission reduction pathway that we need to come up with, and where would a company or borrower sit in making sure that we have a good understanding of the portfolio level alignment as opposed to individually. So again, I'm not trying to undermine the ESG score. That's very important input, but we will not just use that and say, okay, higher the better, or lower, it doesn't mean we will lend, but rather because the way we think about net zero journey is to facilitate the whole of economy transition. And also people, I'm sure this is also important for you, just transition is another aspect that we have to think about. You don't want to create stranded sector, stranded communities, stranded people. So how do we facilitate the transition of those sectors that may not be green yet, but this is all about transition finance. So ESG score, but with also thinking about what's the role of that particular company or sector in net zero society. That's the bit of a analysis that we also have to do, thinking about the qualitative input from our clients and also from the government policy, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be our approach.
So actually you touched upon an interesting point, and you looked at it from a debt perspective, but since we do both debt and equity, what I've been trying to tell my teams is that to actually identify companies that are sort of high on the emissions intensity, and how do we work with them to reduce it. So actually that's where you're going to create a lot of value from an equity perspective, is getting into what I would call the gray or the brown companies and transitioning them towards green. So we have 5.5 minutes, and I want to give the audience a chance to ask you some difficult questions. So in 30 seconds, we've discussed a fair amount in the last 40 minutes. If we were to be sitting here, if you're invited back next year or the year after, 30 seconds, what would success look like to say we've moved this whole thing on data forward? Let me start with you and go this way.
Sure. So as I said, it's about scale is everything, right? So we make sure, let's say 5 years from now, all the company will have their data available, whether it's NZDPU or whatever the database will be available. However, would that allow us to finance trillions of dollars of funding gap that we're talking about? I don't think so. So there must be government policy, enabling environment, all that things are important. One last thing. For banks to finance transition strategy, it's not just a high-level strategy that may be covered in the disclosure, but rather identifying the actual project. And the paper that we produce from Net Zero Banking Alliance focuses on the delta of emission reduction, or what I would call emission reduction return on investment. So you do 500 million loan. What's the delta? What's the emission reduction that you can achieve through that funding would be very important for us to understand, not just the company level reduction. So all these data will be important for us to do actual financing. So hopefully 5 years from now, we'll be sitting here and say everything is available. Thank you.
Yes. We think climate action or disclosure should be based on the science. CDP is targeting to achieve goals based on science-based actions. And financial institutions, measurement, report, taking action, and report. This kind of loop will be a key to achieve net zero journey.
I also have a similar perspective. So standardized and structured data set along the digitalization of reporting and taxonomy to bring clarity, transparency, and interoperability of data flows to users and the data consumer of the reported data. Thank you.
And I think from my perspective, I mean, I completely agree with everyone here. Not much to add to that, to be honest. I guess 5 years from now, what I would like to see is the end to any debate about, double materiality or the standardization of sustainability data, because I feel like in the sustainability space, we have a tendency to like talk in circle and like kind of be in our own bubble. And I feel like in 5 years, we should be on the implementation stage of actually like financing real world decarbonization, real world business transformation that lead us to a more sustainable and greener society. Thank you.
I tried to be a bit controversial, but nobody took the bait. So I'm going to be a bit controversial in my ending, in my closing. So clearly there is a need for a global common or a global good. It's global good. Data is a global good in this case. Let's be clear on that. Unlike data in the digital world, which is your proprietary tool, I think with climate, it's a global good because climate is a global good. We do need a standard, absolutely no two ways on that. But we need to be very, very careful. Let's be blunt. A standard which is looking good in the EU will not work in emerging markets. So maybe we have to figure out a way to getting a different standard, a 1-star, 2-star, what works in different countries. And that differentiation is critical, otherwise we're going to leave emerging markets behind. And since I work only in emerging markets, that's where the emissions are going to come from, and we can't afford to leave emerging markets behind. So that is really critical, the importance of a standard. The second is costs. When you look at SMEs, like I've repeatedly said, we cannot leave the SMEs behind. So we need to figure out a way to get these costs so they're manageable and affordable for SMEs. I kept hearing the use of technology, and I'm a big believer in that. But let's also understand every time you have a digital platform or you use algorithms, there is something going into something called a data center, which is hugely has a huge impact on emissions. The last thing I want to say is, which you alluded to, is that, and I'm going to be controversial here, a lot of data coming out, we're not seeing enough solutions. Honestly, there's no point in having scores and everything unless and until we can have solutions and we can go to firms and say, this is what your score is, let's work together on a solution. So my wish the next 3 or 5 years, I don't know where I'll be, is to really see that we've moved forward from just providing data and having scores to also being able to provide practical solutions for these firms to move forward. So with that, a big thanks to the organizers for having us, and a round of applause for the panelists, and I hope you'll have a great afternoon.